Now recognizes Mr. Case of Hawaii for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Gorton. The ranking member started off his introductory remarks with a very broad statement, and his statement was that these bills expand policies that just aren't working. Do you subscribe to that view that the Endangered Species Act and related legislation put in place over the last several decades is not working to protect endangered and threatened species in our country?
Congressman, before coming back to D.C., I served as regional director for a mountain prairie region, the Northern Rockies and the prairies, and we tried to make the ESA work in the real world. I think the Act has seen its challenges along the way. I think that all of us working together can implement a strong work that will support the American economy and protect species, and I think that the targeted regulatory revisions that have been put on the table this summer through our regulatory revisions give us some strategic tools to help improve performance of the Act and make it better for all America.
Okay, but I'm getting to the underlying statement that was made, that our policies are not working. We can debate the specifics of the regulations, and I don't agree with you and your department on the regulatory changes. Nonetheless, those are secondary, tertiary level discussions. I'm asking you whether you are a believer in the basic federal regime to protect our Endangered Species Act, endangered and threatened species.
Yes, sir. I fully support implementation of the Endangered Species Act. I devoted my professional career to enforcing our wildlife management laws. My point was, I've also seen how hard it is to implement these laws in the real world, and that all of us working together can be much more effective.
Okay, so we can start with the premise that we should have some overall federal protection, and then we can talk about exactly how to do it, but you're not ready to throw the whole thing out.
No, sir. Neither is the Department of the Interior.
Okay. Turning to Hawaii specifically, we are, of course, as we will hear shortly from Mr. Smith from my state, who you have worked with, we are sometimes referred to the endangered species capital of the world. We have, of the 1,275 listed endangered species of animals and plants, 503, we're talking about nationally, 503 are from Hawaii, are in Hawaii. We also have another 14 that are threatened. So clearly we have about 40% of the total endangered species and threatened species of plants and animals in our country, 40% in one state. We get about 5% of the funding to protect. Why? Why is that?
So, Congressman, your question is why, when the Fish and Wildlife Service makes program allocations, is the state of Hawaii only receiving a set percentage of it? And we have a variety of programs that we implement, whether it's the Endangered Species Recovery Program, management of the refuges. We try to set priorities against national level objectives. We try to do the best we can to fulfill all the needs out there. Hawaii has remained a priority for the Fish and Wildlife, particularly our approach to look at more of a ecosystem-wide rather than species-wide issues that are out there. We have a number of valuable wildlife refuges, and a lot of our personnel are out there. I was our former budget officer in another life. I'd be glad to follow up with your office and give you some more details on the volume and capacity we have projected into the Hawaiian Islands, as well as what we can do better out there.
Yeah, I think we would both agree that although we can debate over the allocation to Hawaii, and I think 5% is way too low, and so I'd love to spend some time with you on exactly why that is and what your formulas are, and to dig at some of the assumptions under your formulas. For example, you're dealing with ecosystems, and we have a single ecosystem, so we don't cross state lines for a big old, Western ecosystem or anything like that. We have a Hawaiian ecosystem. But I think we would both agree, wouldn't we, that it's one thing to talk about how to slice the pie, but one way to protect our endangered and threatened species is actually have a bigger pie, a bigger effort, a more inclusive effort, and a better funded effort to protect our endangered and threatened species. Would you agree with that? Would it make a difference for us to maximize the funding in this area?
Congressman, if the Congress appropriates additional funding, the Fish and Wildlife Service would mobilize.
Do you think,
that.
sir, that if we increase the funding,
yes,
that
sir,
it would help?
I do. That would be very helpful for our ability to deliver the mission. And again, we would be glad to connect with you and your staff after the hearing to offer you briefings on what we're doing in the Hawaiian Islands and the capacity we already have prioritized out there.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Ordinarily, I would take the liberty of introducing the panelists at this time, but in the interest of time, I know we've got a 4 o'clock Democratic caucus that we're certainly going to want to be at. So we'll just ask the witnesses to introduce themselves. With one exception, Mr. Case has a guest from Hawaii, and I will give him the special privilege of giving that introduction now.
Thank you for that accommodation, Mr. Chairman. I want to introduce Mr. David Smith here to our left. David is the administrator of the Hawaii State Department of Land and Natural Resources Division of Forestry and Wildlife, or DOFA as we call it in Hawaii. DOFA is actually one of the oldest forestry services in our country. It was started just a few years after we joined the country as a territory in the very early 1900s, because the folks in Hawaii at the time focused on the forest, not just for threatened and endangered species, but as a watershed. And they were very passionate about that. DOFA controls 1/4 of all of the land in Hawaii, 1 million acres. David has a very long and illustrious history and career, which I will also, in the interest of time, skip by. But I just want to say that what I hope and expect him to testify to is the value of the Endangered Species Act and other programs, the practical on-the-ground effect of the protection, and what I've already discussed as one of the extinction capitals of the world, an unfortunate description of Hawaii, but nonetheless, progress has been made under federal laws, and I think he'll elucidate that. So thank you for the opportunity to introduce him.
Thank you, Mr. Case, and aloha, Mr. Smith. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Aloha, and thank you for having me here. As Representative Case mentioned, we are unfortunately referred to frequently as one of the endangered species capitals of the world. Hawaii, while having approximately 0.2% of the landmass of the United States, contains about 45 to 50% of the endangered species. So an inordinate amount, more than any other state in the country. We have about 100 plant taxa that have already gone extinct. We have another 200 that have 50 or fewer individuals. It's a pressing concern for our division, who are tasked with trying to protect and manage endangered species. And another unfortunate statistic is that not a single listed Hawaiian species has been taken off the list. And with the idea that every system is perfectly designed to get the results you're already getting, it seems like the funding currently allocated, the only way for a plant to get off the endangered species list in Hawaii is to go extinct, which is not the way that we want to proceed. So the scope and scale of challenges in Hawaii are enormous. There's a huge litany of things threatening species in Hawaii, but the primary overriding issues are invasive species and habitat loss. So between 1990 and 2003, we're having a lot of issues with endangered plant species going extinct. We're losing about one species a year, a steady trickle of species blinking out. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service took some discretionary funds and created the Plant Extinction Prevention Program, which was extremely successful in helping us stem the tide. So since that program was established in 2003, we haven't had a single plant species go extinct. Now that was discretionary funds. Since then, the money has dried up on the federal side, and the state's really been struggling to try to maintain that program in particular, but we do have the baseline, the foundation is set, and we have a lot of good people working on that program. So far it's sort of a fingers in the dike operation, and we're just trying to hold the line and keep species from actually going extinct. But right now it's kind of a rearguard action, and not one that is capable of actually recovering species, so we need a little more funding to give us that critical mass. HR 2918, the Title II, would establish the Pacific Islands Plants Conservation Fund. This is critically needed for the work that we do. The focus is to provide effective long-term conservation of plants and their ecosystems, and I think maintaining the ecosystems is a really important piece, to do the overall management for these species. The bill as written contains a full spectrum of management solutions, which is great. It's development and implementation of management plans, on-site monitoring, law enforcement, outreach and education, all very important pieces of the programs that we need in order to work on endangered species. It also establishes competitive financial assistance. The state does really well with competitive. It's also really important because the agencies in Hawaii and organizations work very well together cooperatively. We have a lot of partnerships built up. We have the Watershed Partnership Program, Invasive Species Council, and so there's a lot of entities. It wouldn't just be the state of Hawaii and my agency in particular, but there are a whole bunch of nonprofits and government agencies across the spectrum that are capable of competing for these funds, and I think it would be good to spread it, as we can. It also requires ample match, and the state has been investing heavily in their endangered species programs, and so the state's already well positioned to be able to match federal funds. Hawaii is also the chair of the Pacific Islands Forestry Committee with the Western Forestry Leadership Coalition, so we work with the Pacific Island territories to try to help them build capacity for their programs, as well as just down in Palau last year for the PIFC meeting, and I think we're making a lot of strides with helping the Pacific Islands in their efforts to protect forests and watersheds and endangered species. As such, Hawaii provides a bridge to the Pacific Islands, and I think we're well positioned to help them take advantage of this funding as well. So Hawaii strongly supports passage of HR 2918, and look forward to continuing to work closely with the federal government agencies on the recovery of Hawaii and the Pacific's endangered plant species. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Smith, thank you for your testimony. I wanted you to follow up on a comment you made about the plant extinction prevention program. You called it extremely successful. I think those were your words. Just a little bit more on that program. How does it work? Why is it so successful?
The success of the program is due in large part to partnerships that we have, both governmental agencies and private landowners. And we work directly with private landowners through the Watershed Partnership Program. It's a voluntary program where private landowners and government agencies work together on a voluntary basis. And we have MOUs already in place. So we're able to work across a broad spectrum. So it doesn't really matter who owns the land, whether it's public or private. What agency owns it. We already have the agreements in place that allow us to go out and work on the land that has the greatest need. It also allows for some landowners, such as Kamehameha Schools, that has some issues with federal funding. It allows us, if the state is involved, then it helps them with that interface. So it's very, very successful in bringing together landowners to work where it's most important.
Okay, so this is a program under the umbrella of the Endangered Species Act, federal programs, which involves a voluntary understanding between the government and private landowners, and it has been very successful in Hawaii in preventing further erosion. As I recall the statistics, we were losing one species a year before the program, and after that, we have not lost any species, although they are still obviously endangered and threatened, but some of the slide has been reversed.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Okay, and what is the status of that program right now, especially from a funding perspective?
Well, it's declined by about 75%. The state's been able to, there was a match involved. The state is back down to the state's funding allocation, and so we're operating at about a 25% level at the moment. We've got a lot of good people in place. We're trying to keep it going with some additional discretionary funding, but it's really a struggle, and having another cash infusion into the program from federal agencies would be extremely helpful. All the people are in place, the infrastructure is there, the agreements are there. It's a shovel-ready program. We can stand it up and increase capacity very quickly.
Shovel-ready, proven program, but insufficiently funded and therefore greater risk.
Yes.
Okay. And then turning to the administration's changes to the Endangered Species Act rules, do you have a view as to what those impacts will mean if fully implemented on the ground in Hawaii? And I'm particularly focused on the proposed weakening of the threatened species category, where essentially they would not continue to have the benefit of the same protections as an endangered classification. Would your view be that under those rule changes, the threatened species would get better, or would they move into the endangered category?
Well, the threatened species changes would remove the protections under endangered. So right now, if you downlist them and don't do a 4D rule, they're still fully protected. If you downlist them and don't do a 4D rule, then they would lose their protections under the endangered species.
And would that place them at greater risk or less risk?
Greater risk, certainly.
Okay, so we would see probably an increase in the number of endangered species if we change that classification or that implementation of that classification.
That's been the trend, yes.
Okay, if not removed from the list altogether by the other alternative you mentioned, which is extinction.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. I yield back.